Let me just share today on our investing. We'll talk a little bit about get-rich-quick schemes and things like this. But let me share a thought from Elder Ballard. And he said this. He said, there are no shortcuts to financial security. There are no get-rich-quick schemes that work. Perhaps none need the principle of balance in their lives more than those who are driven toward accumulating things in this world. Do not trust money to others without a thorough evaluation of any proposed investment. Are people who have lost too much money by trusting their assets to others. In my judgment, we will never have balance in our lives unless our finances are securely under control. So it's interesting. Isn't interesting the relationship? We never will have balance in our lives unless our finances are securely under control. So it's kind of nice you guys are coming to this class to kind of work on developing balance. So I think it's an interesting thought. Let's start with what we're gonna work on today. Give it a second. Okay. So again, remember we talked about those 6 questions. Talked about the 6 questions on Tuesday. And today what we're going to do is we're going to continue on your asset allocation, investment guidelines and constraints, and we'll spend a little bit of time on how do you build and monitor that portfolio. So section 2, your investment plans, here's what I'd like you to do. Again, you're going to open your copy of Teaching Tool 5A. And what we're going to do is I want you to put in your asset allocation targets. Now, we have you divide your time between now and between retirement. So we have kind of an accumulation stage and then kind of in retirement or retirement stage. Do you necessarily only need 2? At one time I had 3 stages, but as I get older and older, you know, I'm getting close to the retirement stage. So for ease, I simplified it down to 2 different stages. I'd like you to use Learning Tool 27, Expected Return Simulation, to get some return expectations. What can you expect? So, you know, I'm going to come in here and we're going to talk about investment policy statements, and we're going to say, you know, maybe I think an expected return of 7% between now until retirement. Is there any way we can go back and use some historical justification for those numbers? I want you to add to your investment constraints. We'll talk about that. Average and marginal tax rates that we talked about, that goes into your investment plan. And then we'll talk about some investment policies as well. On Section 3, securities markets, ideally what we want to do is we want to eliminate fear and greed from our portfolio. You know, someone commented the Dow's at an all-time high. You know what, so do you think for some people that says, well, maybe it's time to invest? Of course, that's the exact wrong thing to do. You know, so but how do we do this? How do we eliminate fear and greed in your portfolio? One of the nice things, you guys are all in students. Most of you don't have a portfolio. So now is probably a good time to put through and let's develop this plan. So just determine if you'll use leverage to invest. I don't recommend it. Choose your investment benchmark for each of your asset classes, and we'll give you some tools there. So, what? I don't think so. I think it's, when's the investment section due? Yeah, I think it's a while. Let me start with a memo that came out to all the bishops and stake presidents. Joni, can I get you to read that for me, please?
General
Just what?
Your brothers and sisters, reports of fraud schemes and unwise investments. You know, I can't read that very well. Sorry.
Okay. Oh, what can I do, please? Sorry.
Reports of fraud schemes and unwise investments prompt us to again counsel members with respect to prudence in managing one's financial affairs. We are concerned that some church members ignore the oft-repeated direction to prepare and live within a budget, avoid consumer debt, and to save against a time of need. Consideration should also be given to investing wisely with responsible and established financial institutions. We are also concerned that there are those who use relationships of trust to promote risky or even fraudulent investment and business schemes. While all investments carry an element of risk, that risk can be managed by following sound and proven financial principles. First, avoid unnecessary debt, especially consumer debt. Second, before investing, seek advice from a qualified financial advisor. And third, be wise. We encourage you to regularly emphasize this.
So what are the principles here? What did he tell us the principles are? Prepare, live within a budget, avoid consumer debt, save against a time of need, and then basically be wise in what you do. Luckily, hopefully I'm qualified. I'm licensed as well. So what we're trying to do here is really, what we're doing in this class is really trying to just to help you to do the things that we've been counseled. How long have we been counseled to stay out of debt? 6,000 years. What was the counsel? Pay thy debt and live. So the counsel hasn't changed. The environment is changed, and so we just need to be able to understand the principles and to work within that environment. So let's go back and just refresh our decision. Someone define an asset class for me. What is an asset class?
Just a way of classifying, just like between cash or equities.
So it's a way of classifying securities. And actually, asset classes are groups of similar securities with some similar characteristics. Hopefully, they kind of move a little bit together. So they're groups of similar securities. So, Skylar, tell me a little bit more of what asset classes are. You said cash. What are some other ones? Equities, fixed income. And with equities and fixed income, can we divide those even further? Small, large cap, international emerging markets, fixed income, what can we do? Junk, corporates, government, and so all of those things. So it's really important that we understand asset classes. Now, Tuesday we talked about what are the principles, like invest long-term and invest tax efficiently. Know what you're investing in. What we're working on today is we're going to work on what should we have in this investment plan. If you think of your investment plan as a GPS to help you accomplish your goals, what things should that plan tell us? Or maybe another way is to say, what mistakes have you heard that people have done in investing? And can we develop a plan? What goals and objectives can we put in a plan to help us to not make that mistake? Let me give you an example. WorldCom Securities. You guys all heard of that. There was a lot of people who had 90% of their retirement income in WorldCom stock. They thought they were being good employees, or I don't know what they thought. But what happens when you have all of your retirement income based on your company stock? What happened when the company went bankrupt? Not only did they lose their jobs, they lost their retirement income as well. So what should our retirement plan include to help us to make sure that we don't have that? Yeah, so maybe we say, you don't have more than some percent, it might be 10%, 5% in company stock. But these are kind of the things that we do. I spent a lot of time as I was putting this materials together, going through and reading what are called investment policy statements. I just call it an investment plan, but that's the finance term for it. I read institutional investment policy. I read nonprofit. We worked with a bunch of individuals, and we put the plan together very similar to what you have. And I want you to know that when I do some consulting work on the side, and the work that I do, we use this plan, about 95% of the plan for the work that we do on the side. So it is good, it is well thought out, it's not perfect, and we'll still continue to add things to it, but I want you to at least think through it. So let's take a couple of minutes and let's talk, what should our GPS be, what should our investment plan be and do to help us to accomplish our objectives? And is our objective just to make a lot of money? Or is our objective to accomplish our individual and family goals? Which I think is the last part. So investing is not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. So let's spend 2 or 3 minutes. So one example would be, don't put more than X amount in, your company stock. Someone want to give me just another one to help people to think? Right. So how about coming up with your asset allocation? Now, Owen, will that asset allocation change when you get older? When you get my age, will your allocation change? Yeah. So what we might do is we'll divide it into 2 periods, maybe 0 to 55, and then 55 to beyond. And the funny thing is I'm beyond 55. That's amazing. Before a couple years ago, I used to be in the previous stage, and now I'm in the older. And you can set that stage too. Some of you may decide you want to retire early. You want to retire at 55. Will that have an impact on your plan? Yeah. So we also talked some things the plan needs to have is, your tax rates in there. So you'll know what those are. But let's spend 2 or 3 minutes in our groups and see if we can come up some things. What are some things that our investment plan should entail? Because ideally what we want to do, again, this is our GPS to get us from where we are now to where we want to be, which is financial self-reliance. Okay, let's take some time. I like to hear noise. What are you trying to do? Which is what we want to eliminate is the fear and greed. Oh, we got greed now, okay, let's go on. Fear now, let's pull it out. And that's what I want. How do you build that C12 portfolio? Is there one Okay, someone want to give me some counsel? And to a large degree, what are we trying to do? We're trying to eliminate fear and greed from the portfolio. All these people who say the stock market's going up right now, now's a good time to invest. Are they buying at the high or the low? You know, they're buying at the high. You know, and then once the market starts falling, they say, oh, this is gambling, and they sell it out. And when did they sell it? The low. If we do what everybody else does, we'll get what everybody else gets. And so what I want you to do is, what are those things that our investment plan or our investment policy statement is a guide to help us to make wise financial statements. It's a guide. It's part of what we call being wise. Now let me just, let's give some ideas. What did you come up with in your groups? No one came up with it.
Like sticking to like the risk tolerance that you have, sticking to like that allocation and not adding more risky.
So risk tolerance. And how do you maintain the risk in your portfolio? By your asset allocation. So that also comes back to how often will you rebalance? You know, and try to think of the years. You know, in the late 2000s. Markets had really ran up. And a lot of people started their 60-40 allocation, and 3 years later, they were at like 90-10. So they were a lot more risky than they intended to be. And then when the market tanked, all of a sudden they got hurt a lot worse. And so how often are we going to rebalance? And we'll talk about that. Other things that it should include. What benchmarks? You know, because how do you know how you're doing if you don't have a benchmark? You know, again, last year, if you went 15%, did you do well or do poorly? You had a 15% return last year. Did you do well or do poorly? Well, if it was large cap, you were about average. However, if you were international, you underperformed. So you need to know what your benchmarks are, and we need to be able to compare those. Other things. I was talking with Joni over here, and the point here is what we want to do is we want to give you concrete things to help you as you manage your portfolio. And you have a lot of experience here, so let's kind of share some of these, and then we'll kind of share that. Skylar.
How much you would invest in one single, how much of your allocation would go into one single investment?
Yeah, one single stock. I've known people who have 40% in a single stock. Does that make a lot of sense? No, again, it's that fear and greed. Well, it's already done really well, so I'll keep buying it. But again, how much? And you know, it's most institutional accounts, it's like 7.5% at cost. You know, and if the institutions do that here, then you know, this is something to think about. You know, in our asset management class, that's the maximum we'll invest in any account. Other things, yes. How actively? And for most of us here, our jobs, we're not portfolio managers. So ideally, if we can get a good asset allocation with good funds, you know, with our 1 to 2 hours, 1 to 2 hours a week, we can manage it. And truthfully, how often do I look at my portfolio? I look to see what it is, and then I rebalance about once a year. Other things, You know, and what percent is actively managed? What percent is passively managed? And you know, I did active management for 13 years, plus the 12 years we've been here. I'd probably say 70 to 80% of my portfolio is passively managed index funds. Chase.
I think it's good to consider like taking advantage of the company options that they give you. So as far as like contribution plans or stock options.
Okay.
Or
Company enticements. How about your 401k match? You know what? You don't take that, you're leaving money on the table. And that can be significant over a 40-year career. If you've got options and things like this, taking advantage of those, but being wise in those. You want to make sure that, you know, your income, that, you know, it doesn't represent more than some percentage. Let's take one more and then we'll kind of take a look at this. Reese. Okay. So basically know your asset classes and things like that. Are there things you should invest in and you shouldn't? How about unlisted securities? Good idea, bad idea? I have a good friend. I was a scoutmaster to his son. Found this, you know, couldn't lose deal in the UK, unlisted securities. He put 80% of his assets in it. And it was a couldn't lose, but it did. Boy, and it was tough on him. And so how about investing in unlisted securities? How about lending money to your friends? You know, things like this. So our challenge here is the application. How do we go from what we know we should do or what we think we should do to a plan that will help us to sleep well at night? And again, probably an easier way is to say is, how do we eliminate fear and greed from the portfolio? And that's kind of what we'd like to talk about here. So what we're going to do is we're going to take you through the investment plan. I wish this was bigger, and I apologize for that. Notice on this investment plan, anything that's in a box like this, that's just some information for you. Once you finish that, you'll delete that box. Okay, let's just kind of go through here. So it's an investment policy statement. It is your GPS. I apologize, it's going to be a little bit slow and boring here, but bear with me. So investment plan. You'll put in your name, your spouse. Why do I have you put your age in there? Yeah, so we know what your asset allocation and your risk tolerance is. So you tell me your age and your risk tolerance, and I'll tell you what your asset allocation roughly should be. Now, anytime you see things here, an apostrophe and an underline, that means that there's different, these are kind of the choices you have or something similar. Now, in this one here, you know, by the time you retire, you're going to have lots of things. You're going to have 401ks and Roth IRAs and SEP IRAs and simple and education. So on these here, you can probably just put it, but these are a bunch of different investment vehicles that you'll likely use. You don't have to be using them right now. And then we talk about two different time frames. Notice I wrote this IPS mainly for a 25-year-old person who's graduating this year. So if you want to just get some ideas of what I kind of think, this will give you some ideas. So stage 1 is between now and the 55th birthday. Stage 2 is between 56 and 91 or 56 and 102 or whatever you want to do here. And so during the first, so stage 1 is last 30 years. So this person here is 25. And then, you know, and then kind of goals from each of those things. Now, the second thing we need to do, now we're going to come up with return. Now, how do you calculate return? So notice here we say, okay, the team are not full-time investment professionals. The return is to make a return consistent with the return on a diversified portfolio of assets. It's not a single asset. It's a diversified portfolio of assets. And so what we're going to have you do is we're going to have you bring up Teaching Tool 27. And let's kind of take a look at Teaching Tool 27. And this is a tool to help you would it be nice to have just a little portfolio? You know, we talk about different asset classes. Would it be nice to know what, say, large cap stocks have done over the last 1 and 5 and 10 and 25 years, and maybe 50 and 75? Would it be nice to know what small cap funds have done and emerging market funds? And so what I've done is I've just put a tool here. So let's just take a look here. This data ends in 2011. What did the S&P do last year, 2012? It was like 15%. So realize these numbers are going to be a little bit higher. But notice, 1 year, here's the return in the standard deviation. 5 years, here's the return in standard deviation. And now what we can see is how have these funds done over the long term. Now we can see small cap, here's your mean, standard deviation, treasury bonds, T-bills, inflation, international, emerging markets. How come international, it stops at 25 years? Why don't we have 80 years of data on international? How many people have been investing international for 80 years? It hasn't been around that long. Also emerging markets. Okay, so what we want to do, our goal here is to say, if we have a diversified portfolio, what kind of return could we expect? So can I get a volunteer to tell me your age and what you were on this? Seth, can I pick on you? Okay, how old are you? 25. Okay, and so the first step is your age in bonds. So how much should he have in bonds there? Good. And Seth, what were you on the risk tolerance test? Aggressive. So basically what he would do is he would take that 25% bonds and probably subtract out about 10%. And you know, it could be 5 to 15, something along there with his views. So you would have, say, 15%. I'm going to come here and I'm going to put 15% in treasury bonds, which is kind of a proxy for our emergency fund and cash. I mean, that's our bond allocation. When you first start off, your emergency fund is your bond allocation, and then as the size of your portfolio increases, then you'll add some more bonds and some, you know, inflation linked, some corporate, some other things like that. Okay, notice here there's a drop-down box. I can click on that and look at this mean and standard deviation. 85 years, if I go to 75 years, notice how that changes is if I go to 25 years. So generally, your choice of time period will have an impact on what your returns are. I prefer to go the longest time period possible because hopefully I'm a long-term investor. But what do you want to do? Does it matter? Do you want to go 75, 85? Okay, we'll go 85 years. Okay, now Seth has 85% of his portfolio on his equities. Now he can divide those out. He can do it large cap, he can do small cap, he can do international, emerging markets, REITs. So generally my rule of thumb is generally take about half of it or more for your large cap. What's the logic behind that? Why do I want at least, for most people, now if you're much more aggressive than that, you don't have to do it. But why half of it in your large cap allocation? Yeah, it's the least risky of all the equity asset class. It's still volatile, but it's the least risky. Seth, how much do you want to put in large cap? Yeah? You have the remaining. So you have 85%. Okay, 40%. You want to do the same 85 years? Okay, so we still have we still have 55%. Still have 55%. What other asset classes do you like? Again, I require you to have a minimum of 4 asset classes. Why a minimum of 4? Diversification. So what else do you like, Seth? Okay. How much would you like to put in international? 20%. It's lower than what I have in international right now. But I'm one of the old guys. So, and what did I do? I spent, You know, I spent my career basically in international, so I'm comfortable with international. And mine includes international and emerging markets. Okay, so you've got another 25%. What do you want? How about small cap? You like that too? Now notice that he's aggressive. So that allows us to look at where he is as far as his bonds and cash allocation. Notice he's also, within his equities, he's being more aggressive, more international, more small cap. Okay, so you're required a minimum 4. I don't mind if you go more. So we still have another 5%. Do you like REITs? Do you like emerging markets? Okay, so we'll come up here. Again, drop down box, emerging markets, and we'll put 5%. So now we've got 100%. Now notice our expected return now is 9.7%. Should we put that in our investment plan? The answer is no. So what I'd like you to do is, this is just for recommendations only, but does it give us an idea? If the future was exactly like the past, we might get 9.7, but I would actually think if your calculated return is greater than 8%, I would recommend that you use a return objective of 8%. Now, what do I think going forward? Do I think returns are going to be as good as they have been in the past? Probably not. So I think it's going to be a more difficult time with the increased regulation we have, with the increased taxes, things like that. I think companies are going to have a more difficult time. And so putting it down to 7%, 8% on the high end. You know what the numbers a lot of these large institutional clients are using? They're using 7 and 7.5%. So I wouldn't hesitate to put those numbers in as well. Jaron.
I got a question. So
Okay.
at the very top, you're allocating into bonds and also stocks.
Right.
But is there something else you can invest in besides bonds? Because a lot of people think they're not going to go up anymore because interest rates are so low. Could you go maybe, I mean, it's probably not good to put all in stocks, but maybe like dividend stocks?
Yeah, you could do dividend stocks. Well, let's talk about bonds. I was looking at a Charles Schwab report last night. I don't normally do that, but it came across my desk. And they were looking at inflation-linked bonds, 2012. They were returning, between 5 and 7%. So realize what we're starting out right now, and we just use a single asset class. But realize in the bond side, you can have inflation-linked bonds. You can have short-term bonds. I even have some junk bonds. I got a Vanguard junk bond fund, which hasn't done too badly as well. So the principle is diversification. And once you come up with kind of your overall allocation, then within each of the bonds and the equities, you can allocate based on your risk as well. Now, we had a question over here. Howard, we had a question with Howard, and he says, well, shouldn't I wait to invest in bonds now because interest rates right now are really low, and so bonds aren't a very good return. And shouldn't I wait to invest in the stock market too, because the Dow's at the highest point it's ever been? What do you guys think? Can Howard time the market? I mean, he's as good as he is at what he does. Are any of us good at timing the market? No, we're not. Might it be a good idea just to do dollar cost averaging every month when our money comes in? Sometimes we're buying it when the market's low. Sometimes we're buying it when the market's high. The challenge is people who think they can time the market. And you know what? I can't time the market. But I'm looking over a longer time frame. If I'm looking over a 40-year period, does it really matter kind of where the market's at right now? Generally, probably it doesn't. So what we want to do is we want to be wise in what we do. Now let's continue with Seth. Now, so this would be an allocation. So Seth would use somewhere around 8%, and he could adjust that somewhere between 7 and 8. How about when Seth turns 55? What's his new allocation going to be? So if he's going to stay the same aggressive investor, could he change from an aggressive to more conservative at 55? He could. But let's just use that same allocation. Or same risk tolerance. Now he's 55, so how much will he have in bonds at that point? 55%, but he's an aggressive investor. And you know what? So instead of 15, he'll be 45%. And just for fun, let's just change this to 40 here, and let's just change this to 15% here, just to make the point. The point is, as you get older, your allocations will change. Now let's see what that's done to this allocation. Now notice it's gone from 9.7 down to 8.7. So a whole percentage point return change. So if Seth is coming up with his expected return before retirement, let's say he uses 7.5, and what I'd probably do after, well, wait a second, you're aggressive. I'd probably use 8, and then what I might do for the second period, I might put 7% in, because there's a little bit difference. Now we talked earlier about which benchmarks should we use. Notice that this report here actually gives you these are just my preferred benchmarks. So notice I haven't updated that. Lehman went out of business. It's no longer the Lehman Ag, sorry. Yeah, U.S. Bank of America, U.S. Ag, there's a number of different ones. For large cap, it can be the S&P 500, the Russell 200, or the Russell 1000, International, MSCI EFA, S&P 500 115, MSCI World, ex-US. So there's a number of different benchmarks you can choose, but we just give you some ideas. And also in the plan, we give you some recommended. Reese? And then,
I was going to say, what do you think about like the commodities, like maybe the gold ETF or things like that?
what do you think about, someone asked me this question, what do you think about gold? He asked me this question yesterday. Good deal or a bad deal? I told him in 1977, I bought gold at $760 an ounce. And it wasn't until 30 years later that I actually made some money on that. Where does gold get its value? Does it have intrinsic value? It doesn't. How's gold done the last few years? If you look at 5 years and you extrapolate back 100 years, it's a good deal. But all these people who, again, fear and greed side, who think, oh, you should put 80% of your portfolio in gold, and the people who are pushing that are the gold companies. So again, the principle is diversification. Do I think it's a bad idea to maybe take 5% of your portfolio and to put it in some gold stocks or a gold ETF? Probably not. Would I do any more than that? Probably not. We need to be wise in what we do. And you got to be careful when someone's selling a product like that. They say over the last 5 years, it's outperformed all the other assets. Yeah, but over the last 85 years, it's been a crummy investment. Just go talk to my professor. And it was really funny. This person was an MBA student. He says, yeah, I bought it at 680. we had fun commiserating together over how long that has been a poor investment. So be wise in what you do. Gold has no intrinsic value except for what people are willing to pay for it. It does not give you a dividend. It does not think so. So be careful on that. But again, if you want to increase your asset classes, if you've got your good emergency fund, you've got your bond allocations, your stock, putting a small allocation of that is not a bad thing. Yes?
So when we look at what the emerging markets, returns and risk and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, most of the time you'd expect a higher return and have higher risk, but with the emerging markets, you get a 60% better return than the real estate investment trust with less risk.
So now let's change the time period.
Right.
And so what did emerging markets do last year?
I don't know.
I think they did around 14 or 15. What did real estate? So realize all of these asset classes have their ebbs and their flows. And so the key here is, I'm not timing which asset class I think is the best. But if I have a diversified portfolio, can I have that sleep well? Can I build a portfolio that allows me to sleep well at night, regardless of what happens? And that's what we want. Our goal isn't to shoot the lights out. Our goal isn't to be able to pick the asset class that does the well. No one's able to do that. But if we can have a portfolio consistent with our risk level, it can make we can accomplish the goals that we've set. And it won't take 40 hours a week to be able to accomplish that. So let's continue on. So now here we have now, okay, a 25% U.S. bond index is measured by, this is by the aggregate. What is it now? Barclays aggregate. So measured by the aggregate bond index, 50% large cap portfolio. So we give our allocation, our asset class, and our benchmark. Allocation, asset class, benchmark. Allocation, asset class, benchmark. Now what I want you to do is I want you to copy this little section here, because you're going to put it 3 other places in the plan. So make sure allocation, asset class, benchmark. So in Seth's place here, he would do an 8% return. And then he would have 15% bond index as measured by the Barclays aggregate bond index. He had 40% large cap portfolios measured by the S&P, 20% international portfolios measured by EFA, 20% small cap is measured by the Russell 2000, and 5% emerging markets is measured by Morgan Stanley Emerging Markets Free, MSCI Emerging Markets Free. So, and then what he's going to tell me is what was his the returns of the first asset classes were measured over 80 years, the third and fourth over 15, whatever he puts there. So I know how he got to that. So it's not enough to say I want an 8% return. Now you can go back and say, okay, this is what the return has been for the S&P. These are the return. So do you see what I'm trying to do? Is I'm trying to give you support to help you to make these decisions. And then we're going to come here to the second part here. And we're going to say, now what about stage 2? Stage 2, now in Seth's case, it would be a 45% bond index, Barclays, 30% large cap, basically his new allocations. And again, same information here. And again, I say if it shows greater than 9%, use an estimate between 6 and 8. Okay, so any questions on the expected return? Do you see how we come up with this? Okay, let's go to the second one. How about risk? How do we handle risk? Now, we took a risk tolerance test. And notice the first line of that risk one here. It says the investment team is considered, in Seth's case, he was considered an aggressive investor. So I know he's 25. I know he's an aggressive investor. And so he should have roughly 15% in bonds and the remainder in equities. So we can actually go through here. Now, do you think it'd be worthwhile? Do you guys know if I said, okay, they're willing to manage the portfolio at a monthly standard deviation of about 4.6%? Does that mean anything to anyone here? No. How about it, but if we change and says, we accept the risk of a diversified portfolio. And not only does Seth accept the risk of a diversified portfolio, but it's his diversified portfolio, which in his case is 15% bonds and cash, and 40% large cap, and 20% international, and 20% small cap, and 5% emerging markets. And so that's why we'll just copy that section. The team is comfortable with the risk of a weighted benchmark stage 1, which is, you'll just copy this over here. It can be copied. And then also the benchmark during retirement, and that can be copied as well. And so what we've done is we've come up and we've taken something that's kind of hard to understand and said, we're willing to accept the risk of this portfolio. Skylar.
So these weights, are they the amount, say we save, $1,000 a month,
Right.
Is that 15%, is that 150 then going to bonds, or we want of our portfolio value to be 15%?
No. Yeah, you can do it either way. The point is your overall portfolio will have a 15% bond allocation. So, right. And so what we want to do is our asset allocation determines the risk of our portfolio. And so we will be watching that asset allocation to make sure our risk doesn't get out of whack. And so if we find that we're, instead of Seth's example, once he gets 20%, he's got 20% in bonds, he probably will start putting more in equities. And so instead of selling his bonds, what he'll do is he'll grow equities faster, or grow his equities until he's down to roughly his 15%. Now, you will have lots of accounts. I have lots of accounts. My asset allocation is about 30% bonds. I have a defined benefit plan, which takes up some of my bond allocation. But I have education accounts for my kids. I have mission accounts for my kids. I have retirement plans for my wife and I. But my overall allocation of all my 401ks and Roth 401ks and IRAs and all of these things, my overall allocation is roughly my 70-30 allocation. And so what I do is I just watch that, and as you know, like last year, the allocation started to inch up on my equities, and so what I did is I actually did some donated appreciated securities to pay my tithing, and that brought my allocation back on down. So the point here is that that's how we determine our risk. Now let's talk a little bit about investment guidelines. As we go through, we need to talk about what are our guidelines in our stage one, which is before retirement. So how are they invested? So we talk about should be considered long-term assets, not be needed for many years, with the exception of, you know, kids going to college, kids going on missions, kids getting married. With 6 daughters, I have to be worried about kids getting married. Then stage 2, what's the stage 2? We want some income generation, go on missions, prepare for increased healthcare costs, you know, and things like that. So we have different guidelines for each. And now the thing to realize is there are some constraints. So how do we what constraints do we have? And there's really 4 constraints that I think we need to be concerned about. Liquidity, how soon are you going to need the money? So we need to think about that. Okay, well, you know, I have a daughter who just got back from her mission. She's going to start school again in September. You know, we're going to need some money there. My son gets back in November. You know, he'll start in January. We're going to need some money there. So we've got these liquidity fees. We've got some other constraints. How about time horizon? You know, how soon do you need the money? You know, some of you may be thinking about going on to grad school. You know, that's a liquidity constraint. Then we've got taxes. Why do we need to take into account taxes? Yeah. And so here's where you put in your marginal and your average tax rates. And then the last one is any unique needs. Special needs kids, desires to help through charitable giving, things like that. Okay, now we move to our investment policy. So we talked about some of the plans. How about acceptable and unacceptable asset classes? Is that something that's important? You know, I'm amazed that people, very smart people, will invest in things that are not very smart if they'd sit back. They get so excited, you know, the fear and the greed kicks in. So if you can say what you will invest in. So corporate bonds, I give you some ideas. Corporate bonds, treasuries, munis, you know, cash funds as well. How about stocks? How about, you know, we talk about here, US, ADRs, international, emerging markets. And how about total assets? What's the we talked about what's the maximum you'll put in any one stock or fund. And mutual funds, you can have more. Like I probably have 20% of my assets in one mutual fund. It's just a big Vanguard fund, but that's okay. But mutual funds and index funds are different, but any single stock. And how are we going to handle short selling, buying on margin? What's short selling? Go ahead, Reese, what is it?
Yes, you borrow it and then hoping it will go down.
So you borrow a security, hoping it will go down. You sell it, and you hope to replace it at a lower price. Is borrowing a security the same as borrowing money? Yeah. So do we want to use debt to invest? How about buying on margin? What are you doing there? You borrow money to invest. Is that what our prophet has told us to do? You know, it's not. It's debt just like it is. How about unacceptable asset classes? You know, things like commodities, collectibles, foreign currencies, options, futures. Are these good ideas? Maybe the commodities, if you have it in a fund that's diversified. But options and futures, I tell people it's a great way to make a small fortune. But you have to start with a big fortune first. You know, my neighbor actually bought a company that did options and future selling. And he says, you know what, this is a really good company, except it's just so volatile. You know, he's the owner of the company, and he admits that there's just too much volatility in that. Tell me.
You're not investing in speculative, but you're using it to hedge.
Okay, I think, you know, writing covered calls or things you already have, I think that's fine. But naked options, I think, are accidents waiting to happen.
I've heard that once you have a pretty good portfolio, it's okay to maybe invest $50 a month, $50 a year, some small portion in something that you want. Maybe you want to feel like you want to be speculative, because then you still have a good portfolio and you still feel like you can be
Right.
free with your money.
And so watch your spouses and make sure it never goes beyond that 3% or 2%, and just call it entertainment. Just don't call it investing. I mean, that's okay. Can we do things for entertainment purposes? Yeah. You know, again, remember, you know, dates are a fixed expense and not a variable expense. And so, you know, once the size of your portfolio rises. But yeah, again, just don't call it. Just don't call it things. Now, investment benchmark. So again, we've got here which, again, it's allocation, asset class, and benchmark. So be wise here. And now notice here, now we go our asset allocation strategy. So so we've got our target, our minimum, and maximum. In Seth's case here, his equities, U.S. and international, would be 85%. Bonds and cash would be 25, or would be 15. So just, and then I've got others. It would be any REITs. Seth might decide he was going to take emerging international down to 15% and put 5% in REITs. But realize I have like 10 different asset classes in my portfolio. And that's important. And then stage 2 after retirement. So a REIT is a real estate investment trust. It allows you to buy property, real estate property, just like a financial security. Why would you not want to put 40% of your portfolio in REITs? What's your biggest asset that you will have, most of you? Probably your house. So that's already real estate there. And so by overweighting your REIT asset class, you're actually undiversified here. So now we get into the investment strategy. What are we going to do? You're going to do active, you're going to do passive. And I recommend both. Again, I said I'm probably 80% passive right now. I'm active on the asset allocation side, which asset classes, but I'm passive on the stocks. So, but can you do both? The answer is yes. And can that change over time? Yes, but at least articulate it. How about individual assets? At what point is a good idea to buy an individual asset? Single stocks and single bonds. For most people, I recommend you do that after you have a portfolio of about $500,000. I mean, you guys can do that yourself. It's just that equities are just probably the most expensive of the asset classes. And so buying individual stocks when your portfolio is really small is just very not cost effective, and you're basically not diversified in things like that. Then we get into funding strategy. We'll talk about the priority of money. How are you going to fund it? And hopefully you're going to pay the Lord first, then you're going to pay yourself second. The nice thing about our funding strategy is if you're overweight bonds and you want to lower that down, you don't sell bonds. What you do is you just buy more equities. And then new investment strategies. What's the maximum? Investments in company stock, unlisted investments. I told you the story about the guy who, all these UK unlisted investments. And I would recommend for most of you to put less than 0. You won't invest in anything that's unlisted. And then we get into portfolio monitoring. How are you going to monitor the portfolio? Quicken makes this really easy. How often are you going to rebalance? Portfolio communication. How often are you going to sit down with your spouse and say, how have you done? My problem is my wife says, oh, you just do the investments. And so I did, and I didn't do a very good job. Finally says, you know what, we need to sit down. So once a year we sit down, and then she noticed how poorly we had performed versus our benchmarks. She says, why are we investing in these? And I was investing in a bunch of company mutual funds. And I said, because I'm trying to be a nice guy to my fellow portfolio managers. And she says, you know what, that's not a good reason. And so we sold them out and bought some index funds that follow the asset classes, and we've done better. So what I've always found is when my spouse and I together make decisions, we always do better than when I do them individually. And then at the end, we all sign it. Now, part of your investment plan, you're going to have expected return simulation and benchmark. That is teaching tool 27. Investment process spreadsheet, which is teaching tool 13. And then financial pages from Morningstar, and we'll talk about those. But do you get a sense of what we're trying to do? It's our GPS to help us to make wise decisions. So we don't, I mean, I've got lots of stories. I could sit here for hours telling you stories of mistakes investors have made. But what we don't, we talked before about insurance. Ignorance is a covered peril in insurance. It's not in investing. One mistake you make can have significant impacts. And so what we try to do is let's build that GPS. Let's not let fear and greed drive the decisions, but let's build a sleep well portfolio that you can wake up in the morning and it really doesn't matter. And that's kind of what we're trying to teach in this class. Our goals are not to get a portfolio that returns 14% a year. Our goal is to be able to accomplish the things that we need. It's to return and live with our Heavenly Father. It's to be able to serve and bless the lives of others. It is to be good parents to our children.
When we have a certain fund that we've invested into and it's underperforming the benchmark,
Right.
some funds will be up, some will be
Right.
down. How many years of underperformance do you think we should allow before we switch funds?
I used to manage money, and what I hoped, what I did is what other people would do. They would usually give me about 36 months. After 36 months, if I couldn't bring that up, then I think that, at least to me, that was a good, that's what I hope my investors would give me. And so I don't have a good answer, but that's kind of a good rule of thumb that I used. Okay, let's move on. Can you abdicate financial responsibility for your investments? Can you give it to someone else? Will they spend as much time on it as you will? Will they give it the thought? And the point is, we have to take responsibility. We can work with other people, and please don't think that all brokers are like this. I've got very good friends, and I worked in this industry for 13 years, and I've got very good friends who are brokers, and they are salt of the earth. But realize that we need to take responsibility. Any thoughts of what people have said about, this idea of writing an investment policy statement? Let me just share. This came out, Wall Street Journal, May of last year. They said this. It's called "A Written Plan Can Help Your Portfolio." Write it down. That's the message increasing numbers of investors and advisors are hearing. And when they actually follow through, they reap the rewards. For all kinds of investors, creating a written investment policy statement and sticking to it, you notice has to be two, can be a good way to produce steadier returns in volatile times. It instills discipline. It can clarify strategies. For investors with advisors, it can define what both parties expect from the relationship right from the start. Professionals who advise pension plans, foundations, and other institutional accounts are required by law to write up investment policy statements for the clients. These documents describe how the money is to be managed and detail things like asset allocation, time horizon, and any restrictions on holdings based on moral or ideological convictions. Advisors for individuals and even self-directed investors are urged to put it in writing too. Drafting a statement requires thinking about one's portfolio as a whole and planning for the long term. Periodically reviewing the policy can help investors stay the course in challenging markets as well. So, what's the recommendation out there? It's to put a plan together. And then here's something here from the financial planning. Getting formal. It says, now is the time to make sure you have a comprehensive investment plans in place for all of your clients. They say, when you create an investment plan, you focus on preserving the wealth of your affluent clients. You are my affluent clients. I want to preserve your wealth. And so they talked about, what does a plan do? Number one, it clarifies and solidifies the client's goals. Number two, it provides long-term discipline. Number three, it promotes clear communication between you and the clients. Number four, it says impresses the clients. I don't know if you guys are impressed or not. And then the question, what do they include in a plan? Number one, long-term goals, objectives, and values. You can see what we've done. Two, the definition of a level of risk that the client's willing to accept. Three, the expected time horizon for the assets. Four, the rate of return objective and asset classes used. Five, the investment methodology used. And six, a strategic implementation plan. So, are we doing anything strange by forcing you guys to put this plan together? No. But what we are doing is forcing you to think through the issues. Again, our goal isn't just a 14% return. Our goal is to be able to help you to accomplish the things that you need to in life. To accomplish your missions that you are here. To return with your children. Your families back to Heavenly Father's presence. To have a good life. That's what we want. And the finances can help us to do that. Let me just share what I call the difference between a salesman and a trusted financial advisor. And what you want to work with a trusted financial advisor. And again, generally, Most advisors aren't going to be interested in having you as a client until you have at least $500,000. So the good news, what we teach in this class will take you from where you are now to probably a couple of $1 million. And even beyond that, because as you get more experience, you'll learn a lot more here. But let's just talk about that. Trusted advisor, he has a process for creating a comprehensive plan. This one has a technique for making a sale. Hopefully you see me as an advisor, because what we are is putting the plan together. Interested in what's important to you and your significant issues. The second one is just concerned with making the sale. Requires you to bring data, but does not require disclosure of information you are not comfortable with sharing. Again, that's the same thing with this class here. Doesn't require you to do anything but show up. I'll let you just read through these here. Expresses interest, refers to your impending demise. Do you ever notice that people spend a lot of time on all the negative things that could go on? Realize when all they talk about is the negative, they're trying to make a sale. Professional, inspires you, prey on your fears and insecurities. We need to stay away from that. Products. So our key here is we want to build a plan to allow us to sleep well at night. You won't have the big stories, you won't have all the things about the stocks who did well, but you probably won't have the negative one stories as well too. And again, when it comes time to retirement, you'll laugh all the way to the bank. And I think that's what's important. Reese?
So right now, like you don't have that flexibility flying and
Right.
how would you go about doing that?
And actually, you'll do it. Most of you will probably just go directly to the mutual fund company. And we'll talk about that. So we've got one more day of Tuesday. We'll talk about building a portfolio, and next Thursday is when we actually start talking about building. How do you pick the financial assets, and how will you buy those? And we'll actually work with you there. So let's continue there. How do you buy and sell individual stocks? Let's just kind of talk about how that works. So number one starts with you, and then you place the order to the broker. And it can be through a computer. You can go through the broker, things like that. They send it off to the stock exchange. It's executed, and you get the operations here. So are you required to have a broker or an account there? And the answer is yes. How about buying and selling mutual funds with a load? What's a load? What's a load? It's a sales charge. It's a fee you pay for the privilege of investing in that fund. And it's usually it can be 4 to 5.5%. Now, do you have to invest in load funds? The answer is no. There's a ton of no load funds out there. What do you think research has found? Do you think that load funds outperform or underperform no load funds? Actually, if you just take into account the performance, they found that there's no statistical difference. But when you take into account the loads that you pay, research has found that most always they underperform. So you don't have to do this. So it takes you again, it goes to the broker, mutual fund company, sends you operations. And if you want to pay the broker something, I prefer working with fee-only financial planners, but that's just my preference there. But notice here, you can actually go directly to the mutual fund company. And not only do you don't pay any loads, there's no transaction costs and no other fees. Remember, one of the principles is you want to minimize taxes and fees. So it's really important that we do this. Now, let's do a couple of case studies before we're done. I want to do one on selling short. And then we want to do one buying on margin. So we've got Ann sold short 400 shares of stock, selling at $90 per share. People will say, well, yeah, go ahead and sell short. It's so easy. You can make so much money. You've got leverage there. And if the stock market goes up or the stock market goes down, you can still make money. Be careful of the hype. So over the 6-month period, the company paid out 2 dividends. So she borrowed shares of stock. She sold it. 2 dividends of $150 per share. Total commission cost for buying and selling the shares came to 125. She covered the shares. She sold the shares 6 months later. So what's her profit or loss from the transaction, assuming the price declined to $45 per share? So basically the stock dropped in half. Does that happen very often? No, not really. People would like to think that it happens more often. Or what's the profit or loss if the stock rose to $250 per share? And considering we don't have a lot of time, someone want to take me through it? How do we do this analysis? Sorry, I don't have, we're getting short on time. So, price of the stock fell to 45, so how much did she pay? So she sold it short at 90, so she has 36,000 coming in. What expenses did she have to pay? Now, so 400 shares. How about those dividends? When I was at Montgomery, we would lend shares. So we would allow people to borrow our shares, and then they could borrow those shares. If I needed those shares, how could I get those back very quickly? And the answer is yes. But we used to make a couple $1 million a year on, if I remember right, I could be wrong. And luckily that went back into the fund and it increased the returns for our shareholders. But when you sell short, you have to replace all the dividends. So there's 18,000, she covered at that, gross profit, but now she has to pay back the dividends because she borrowed the shares from me. I would have had those dividends coming back in, so she had to make me whole. Plus her transaction costs. So she made 16, there's a lot of money there. Let's go take it the other way again. We're going to do the same thing, only now they covered it at 250. Do you still have to pay off the dividends? Yes. Do you still have to pay the transaction costs? Now she's lost 65,000. What do you notice about these two sides? Is the upside limited or the downside limited? Yeah. So you can lose significantly more than you had put in, and I don't think people realize that risk. And again, when the prophet says we shouldn't use debt to invest, and then the second one here is now you're buying on margin. Well, hold on, let me go to the next one. Now this person's buying on margin. Half of it's purchased on margin, used half of their own money. So they bought it. So she bought it at 15, increased to 30. That's something that does, that's a doubling of it. But let's just kind of take us through that because of time. So purchase at 15, price increased to 30. She put up 7,500. Money borrowed, so that was their 15,000. Later they sold it at 30,000, so she's got a gross profit. Interest for the 6 months. Net profit is 1,450. Oh, it seems really cool. No, let's say what happens if it went the other way. Decreased to 5. Now she's at 30. Gross profit minus her loan, minus 10,000. So I hope you get a sense that there's a lot of risk in this. There's a lot of wisdom in what we've done, what the prophets have said about staying out of debt, and don't use debt for speculative investors, and be wise in what you do. So let's kind of summarize what we've talked about. Number one, we talked about the importance of your plan and how to prepare it. We've actually gone through the entire investment plan. We talked about why it's a good idea. It gives you help. It helps you to think through logically so you can make better decisions. What we wanted to do is we want to eliminate fear and greed from the portfolios. And an investment plan, if you follow it, will do that. We talked a little bit, didn't spend much time on get-rich-quick schemes, but we talked about what's the risk on selling short and what's the risk of buying on margin. You can lose significantly more than your money at risk. So it's important that we don't do that. Talked about securities markets. We used the Saturday Night Live video here. But be wise. You don't want to abdicate financial responsibility. They are helping you. They are not doing it for you. We talked about the differences between a salesman and trusted financial advisor. And then finally, we just went we went through and we talked about, if you're buying stocks, you need a broker. If you're buying load funds, you need a broker. You have to pay that commission. But the principle is invest low cost and tax efficiently. And so for most of you, going directly to the mutual fund company is not a bad way to do it. Questions? Okay. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you on Tuesday. I'll have all everything handed back for Tuesday.